Hello, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Prof. Jahan and I are going to touch on an area of the simulation process that tends to often get ignored, but one that we feel is a key element to a successful debriefing. Now, that will be the debriefer's role. The past webinars have touched on the differences of feedback and debriefing, and so I'll not go into those details in this presentation. Now today it's all about the debriefer, and for a start one should take note that whether we are debriefing the students or we are debriefing the debriefer, there are many similarities in terms of pre-briefing and the debriefing per se and the whole process of preparation for the debriefing. Sometimes, and that includes me as well, we think that everything went well because during our debriefing session there were good conversations, there were discussions, and but actually it may not have. Now there are many reasons for that, and one is that sometimes we've been doing this for so long that we become complacent or overconfident, or it could be the other extreme where you are very junior, a novice in debriefing, and do not have the experience to know what you are missing out during the debriefing. By the end of this session, we hope that you'll be able to identify and understand the key elements in debriefing. That's number one. Number two, you identify facilitators or enablers during a debriefing that will help you have a successful debriefing session, and also be able to identify barriers that prevent you from having a successful debriefing session. And finally, we hope that some of the practical sessions that we shared today would be able to help you in your future practical sessions. I will start by just going back a little to the debriefing per se, and then go on to the what, why, who, and how of debriefing, and hopefully end off the session with a healthy discussion with everyone present here today. What is the concept or definition of debriefing? Now, the earliest known use of the verb debrief was in the 1940s at the end of the World War II. It was originally a military word, but has since become a common word among the healthcare simulation community. Debrief is a simple yet powerful tool that enables participants to reflect on why something happened the way it did, and it's sometimes also called an after-action critic, or rather it used to be called. Now, many definitions have been put forth, but what they all point towards at the end of the day is that it's a process that occurs between two or more people during or after a simulation experience where there is guided reflection, identifying gaps and knowledge and practice that would help to improve future actions. Now, looking at learners or even those that are getting debriefed, they will reflect on their action during a simulation learning experience. What does the facilitator do? Facilitator identifies thought processes or initial thought frames and guide to consolidate and change those processes, or rather thought frames if they were not accurate, for instance. Now, all the debriefing rules or strategies that we talk about in debriefing of the learners is applicable when debriefing is done to debriefers. For instance, establishing a psychological safety, that means setting the stage, preparing the debriefer mentally, and also technical preparations for this, managing cognitive load during the discussions, and using debriefing styles that are tailored to the needs, like learning outcomes, for instance. Whatever it is that you want to achieve with the debriefer. On the question of who debriefs the debriefer, you can be debriefed by a peer, a subject matter expert. This is usually when the simulation involves specific or uh, disciplines and so on. And could be a specially trained individual for debriefing, especially in team simulation, teamwork simulation sessions that involve communication skills and so on. You don't need a subject matter expert. Then there are self-assessment tools that can be used, which we will share later, that will help in self-assessment of the debriefing, for instance. And then, well, there's a question of whether a learner can give you some kind of a feedback. So I wouldn't say it's like a debriefing, but at least a learner's point of view might help the debriefer improve. And of course, if you have a mentor and you are a novice, it will be very helpful to have them debrief you if you're the debriefer. Now let's go on to why debriefing a debriefer is necessary. The aim here is to identify gaps in debriefing performance, explore them with the debriefer, guide them to reflect on their actions, and help to close those gaps that are identified. Now, this can be achieved together with suggestions from the debriefer and the debriefed. In keeping with the debriefing assessment for simulation in healthcare dash for instructor, referenced here in this slide, there are important elements of any debriefing that the debriefer needs to focus on. Remember, the idea is to be able to identify, explore, and close the debriefer's performance gaps in these areas. Now, let's look at these key elements. The question you would ask would be, did the debriefer establish and maintain an engaging learning environment? Did he or she perform a structured and organized debrief? Was she or he able to provoke an engaging discussion? Did she or he identify and explore performance gaps? And at the end of the whole session, bridge the gap for future performances. I know it's a little confusing, but imagine that you're a senior consultant and you have experience with debriefing, and you're now observing your junior, a newly joined member of your team, conducting a debriefing session with a group of trainees after he conducted a simulation session with them. Now, you will use the 5 key elements that I mentioned earlier to guide you when you debrief him after his session with the students. Now, let's look at the elements one by one. Now, the first important element to address is, did this debriefer establish and maintain an engaging learning environment? For instance, did this individual set the stage where the learners were introduced to the simulator and the equipment, ground rules were explained like the do's and the don't, and even obtained a fiction contract with the learners? Now, were clear objectives set and a safe learning environment maintained with respect and kindness? Other factors that are important would be establishing and or rather in acknowledging the limitation in realism, and also acknowledging that learners may act differently in a simulated environment. Now, this person, this individual, this junior should demonstrate that. Now, did this junior also ensure that learners were clear on what is expected of them and the point of what they are doing and the importance of those? And did this individual also explain his role as a debriefer and what he is going to do during the session with them. Remember that when you are going to debrief this individual later after the session ends, remember that you are the senior and this person is a newly joined team member. So there is a lot of things that are important here. What you expected him to do with his students is what you are expected to do with him. And it's very important here because since you're the junior and you are the senior and he's the junior, that is by itself quite intimidating for him. And you need to be really careful not to jeopardize that psychological safety. So ensure a safe environment because that's going to affect the outcome of your debriefing with this person. Because remember, what you want this person to do is improve in areas of weaknesses that you have identified and be able to do better the next time he carries out a simulation session with the student.
Let's move on to the next key element, structured and organized debrief. Whatever debriefing technique is used, it is important to help our fellow debriefers ensure the debriefing they conduct are structured and organized. This is extremely important as significant learning occurs in a debrief and time is usually limited. The logical flow of emotion before cognition allows learners to vent before orienting them to what happened in the simulation. Allowing the learners time to vent and not belittling their emotions help them calm down and reframe for the cognition phase. For the cognition phase, most debriefing techniques will gather and analyze learners' thoughts and actions and help them analyze these thoughts and actions before generalization for future application. When debriefing our colleagues, it is important to help them identify if they were able to help learners make sense of the simulation session, address their learners' concerns, and close their learners' knowledge and performance gap. It is important to emphasize that debriefing is a collaborative process, therefore asking questions that prompt discussion and spending appropriate time on topics that are important or interesting to the learners. This should continue into the summary phase. Examples of positive behavior include getting learners to share their learning points, then reinforcing them when shared by learners. Stating that these points, when they are not shared by the learners themselves, and recommending further reading. The third key element is provoke and engaging discussion. How well did the debriefer engage learners, listen to their sharing, and help them in reflection? This is very important to help learners focus, explore their thought processes, and help break down sequences for analysis. An important behavior to look out for and encourage is using observed events, if possible, assisted with videos and replays. It is also important for the debriefer to share their own reasoning about why something is important, as well as sharing personal concerns with supporting evidence, as well as using existing guidelines and resources and cognitive aids. To continue engagement, was the debriefer inclusive? Did he or she elicit different viewpoints? Did they use appropriate verbal and non-verbal cues, listen with the whole body without interruption, paraphrasing and clarifying to support this listening behavior? Did they allow silence to allow thinking? Did they read the room and were aware if learners are struggling, if there were conflicts during discussions? Were they able to refocus the discussion to learning? Next is identify and explore performance gaps. As the main aim of debriefing after a simulation session is to assist learners identify, explore, and close performance gaps, this is a very important element for debriefers to master. One of the debriefer's role is to be able to let the learners know the actual performance when compared to the optimal performance. Some examples of good behavior or positive behaviors are being specific, actionable, being direct but respectful, and being able to provide judgment. This is when the debriefer focuses on the what. When exploring the performance gap, the debriefer also explores the why, i.e. the sources of performance gaps in the other elements that we have mentioned earlier. This is the final key element, bridging or closing gaps for future performance. This is a very, very important point as it helps learners continue performing well or move closer to the ideal performance. The simplest example is eliciting from learners how they can apply current sessions to real life scenario, either one they are seeing currently or in the future. It is very important that the debriefer helps the learner orientate where this learning session fits into the bigger picture of their learning and reinforce the session's learning objectives and intended learning outcomes. Occasionally, it's okay for debriefing sessions to deviate from these objectives if there is a high educational benefit or if there's a requirement to revisit fundamental knowledge to achieve the session's objective, as well as long as it's not done at the expense of the key learning points. Another important point to support this key element is to be able to share knowledge that is current and being able to share underlying reasoning for decisions, guidelines, and practices. Positive behavior also means acknowledging when limits of knowledge are reached. We have gone through these 5 key elements of debriefing to focus on when we debrief our colleagues. Remember, the main aim is to help our colleagues identify, explore, and close their debriefing performance gaps. Let's look at the virtues of a debriefer, and I must also say the debriefed. Debriefing with good judgment is all about being curious. It involves observation of a behavior and then being curious to why this individual did what he or she did during the session. The debriefer must have patience, be self-reflective, objective, and walk the talk. The debrief colleague must also have good judgment, able and ready to accept feedback, able to self-reflect, be objective, and be able to control their ego. We found this quote online. We paraphrased it to remind ourselves that debriefings are meant to identify the correct actions and appropriate application of knowledge. When debriefing colleagues after their own debriefing sessions, it is important to remember the challenges they may face to perform well. Remember to be kind, be curious, be respectful, and elicit their concerns and thoughts. These challenges may be the reasons for gaps in their performance during debriefing. These challenges may be internal or external. Some internal challenges are difficulties in creating and maintaining an engaging learning environment, managing an emotional environment, limited technical skills in debriefing, example, applying the inappropriate debriefing methods to different learners and learning sessions, difficulties in time management and managing unanticipated queries. Some external challenges are misaligned time, place, and person, where there are conflicting scheduling issues, inadequate resources for training in the institution. These are some of the things we can do to help our colleagues close their debriefing performance gaps. To overcome internal challenges, we can support them with training, help them identify frameworks to use, for example, debriefing techniques like the plus delta, advocacy inquiry, and debrief, as well as the DASH framework shared earlier. Colleagues must be mindful to align learning outcomes to the simulation and debriefing and use cognitive aids and guidelines during debriefing as appropriate. Other facilitators for successful debriefing will need institutional support in training, protected time, peer coaching programs, and mentors. INU has an example of an institutionalized peer support or coaching program. This is a developmental program that aims to improve the quality of teaching and student learning. The gist of the program is peer observers provide feedback to their peers on the teaching methods and help each other reflect on their practice. Let's refocus on what we can do individually if we do not already have this program like IMU. We can ask ourselves during reflections, using the 5 key elements to ask ourselves what went well and what I would do differently. We can also video our debriefing sessions and ask our trusted colleagues to watch and give honest opinion and discuss this with us. The 5 key elements can be a useful tool to have a shared language during this conversation. You can visit these resources for additional reading. We have shared 5 key elements for a successful debriefing of a simulation session. These are also applicable for debriefing the debriefer. We went through why these elements are important and provided some positive behaviors to look out for each element. We went through the barriers and facilitators to successful debriefing, and with the subsequent videos demonstrate a practical example on how to apply this information. Thank you.